One of the many qualities that RGG Studio exhibits as game developers is the ability to write compelling villains. Characters that we can genuinely despise with all our being upon meeting them, only for that emotion to completely melt away by the time their story concludes. Such is the case with many fan-favorite characters in Like a Dragon, and that speaks volumes to the quality of writing that's showcased. Naturally, there are instances where the final redemption of a character isn't universally praised, which gives the debates on these events much more nuance. So today, I would like to cover one villain whom I find to be the most misunderstood in the franchise. And knowing the cast of characters we've dealt with over the years, that is no small feat. The man in question is none other than Yoshitaka Mine, the final boss of Yakuza 3. A man who is nowadays mainly remembered as the no change in the plan guy, whose actions were deemed questionable by many fans. Over the course of this video, we will cover the weight of those actions, the depth of his motivation, and the reasons why Mine is not just misunderstood, but also makes for the most important villain in the entire franchise. By this point in the series' history, we've seen two unique takes at crafting a main villain: a childhood friend gone astray, and an ambitious equal who values strength above all else. With Kiryu's character development in the first two games, having such narrative foils made sense, as they mirrored some of his own fears and insecurities. For a villain to be compelling, their actions need to be understandable, or at the very least, be entertaining to the audience. They need to make an impact to differentiate them from what came before. On the surface, Yoshitaka Mine is seen as an emotionless businessman, someone driven purely by profit and rising through the clan's ranks. His public persona is very much a hybrid of Nishiki's and Ryuji's ideologies, but what's interesting about this portrayal is that it lacks the associated impact. Nishiki and Ryuji were showy. They demanded attention and respect from the entirety of their clans through the actions they've taken. They sought self-fulfillment through a pursuit of power. But with Mine, that very pursuit meant nothing. And I don't mean that in terms of the old saying that there are some things money can't buy. I literally mean how he has no genuine interest in the actual wealth he'd obtained, nor the status supposedly sought through the narrative. They may be beneficial on a surface level, but ultimately they are just byproducts of his day-to-day life that the people around him valued above all else. Byproducts that those same people would kill to obtain. Thus his pursuit of them becomes the polar opposite of an innate desire he may feel. This pursuit becomes a forced necessity. Herein we see the first of many similarities Mine bears to Kiryu, who himself is revered for his strength and charisma. Titles like The Dragon of Dojima for Kiryu or The Lone Entrepreneur to Mine have become burdens, because the two of them just want to live their lives uninterrupted. Yet the people around them keep dragging them back into those roles time and time again. With Kiryu being forced to save the Tojo clan 100 times over, or Mine having to handhold every business transaction in said clan to prevent a further downfall like the one shown in Yakuza 2. They're stuck in a status quo where refusing to intervene would lead to even more trouble down the line, because they will always be seen as embodiments of those titles they were given. They will always be challenged because of them, until the day they eventually die. Such is the price of ambition and standing out in a monochrome world. But here's the funny thing. In reality, Kiryu and Mine have taken drastically different paths in life, but ultimately wound up at the same crossroads despite their differing choices. To drastically oversimplify their journeys thus far, they were both orphaned at a young age, wound up joining the Yakuza due to an idealized version of their world, only to wind up fighting each other after being disillusioned by the realities of that world, from which they could no longer escape. If each of the villains Kiryu faced up to now was to challenge his own insecurities head-on, then Mine was the perfect figure to conclude this chapter of Kiryu's life. The entirety of Yakuza 3 was about Kiryu finally settling down with his orphanage, to give those kids the kind of life he never had. But by the end of this journey, he's met with the worst kind of reality check. He has to face someone who is a living, breathing example of how Kiryu himself could have grown up to be, had it not been for people like Kazama, Nishiki, Yumi, and Haruka. While most of them are no longer alive, the lessons he learned from them and the childhood memories they shared made Kiryu the benevolent person he is today. Someone everybody should strive to be. But now when you look at Mine, especially in the final conversations that they share, it really makes the absence of those people hurt much more. If it weren't for them, maybe Kiryu himself would be pointing this gun out of desperation. Mine can't understand why Kiryu can still see the good in people, despite growing up in an equally tragic environment. Because for most of his life, he never had anyone he could call a friend. No childhood crush, no honorable father figure. Yoshitaka Mine is a tragedy born of abandonment and loneliness. You could argue that having good people in his life could have ultimately made him much worse than he is now. I mean, just look at Nishiki. His downfall was in part a result of having lost the emotional bonds he had to Kiryu, Yumi, and even Reina, which led him to act out so violently. But once he finally reconnected with them, when they finally spoke as friends, as people, did he actually manage to find his anchor once again? It was because of that he finally snapped back to being the way he was, fixing his mistakes in the most Nishiki way he could. For better or worse, he did redeem himself in the end, once again due to the bonds that they all shared, bonds that Mine never knew of. So now it's time to address the elephant in the room, or technically the Akala on the roof. Spending your days alone in your formative years is hard. It can irreparably skew your perception of the world and lead you to reject experiences that may ultimately bring you comfort and peace. Sure, you can always find peace in solitude, and many people do, but that is a sentiment that should be a consequence of personal choice and not necessity. Mine's childhood was marred by rejection over something as trivial as monetary value. He was mocked for being a poor orphan every day, only to come home to a person who would just tell him to keep going, to keep working so that one day his talents would be rewarded. In the time when he should have experienced something genuine, human bonds that would inspire and drive him, he was constantly reminded of how frail those bonds could be, even if they were achieved. Mine was touted as being both intelligent and perceptive since birth, so when everyone he met acted so superficially, he realized that they were beyond helping and simply moved on. It wasn't up to him to change the world at large, after all. And as sad as this outlook may be, all it really takes to change it is meeting that one person. Someone who treats you with respect, someone who listens and supports you. In his pursuit of genuine bonds, Mine came into the world of the Yakuza and met Daigo Dojima, a person who had the aura of a natural-born leader. Yet, despite the weight of his role in the world, Daigo spoke to Mine as an equal, not as a subordinate or a disposable tool. He spoke to him as a friend. The community has labeled this bond in numerous ways, but the thing that it ultimately shows is that Mine had finally found a place where he belonged, where he could use his skills to help build genuine connections that all convened in one spot, the Tojo clan. All because of the money he earned and his dear friend, the omnipotent central figure who made it all work. And then, Daigo was hospitalized. The person with the power to bring people together, the person who became a safe haven for Mine, was proven to be just as fragile as anyone else. This was the first time in his life where Mine had something worth protecting, but he couldn't do anything about it. When all is said and done, the money he'd earned gave Daigo the best medical treatment possible, but that wasn't a guarantee he'd actually survive. And this is the point where many people in the community raise the question of Mine's motivation towards the end of the story. If he truly cared so much about Daigo, why would he decide to kill him? And that's an excellent question. In order to answer it, let's take a look at a fairly famous scene from Yakuza 3.
Daigo wa doko da? Doko he yatta?
If you're looking for Daigo, Mine's taken him up to the roof.
Okujou da na.
Putting the meme nature of the scene aside, you would have to wonder why Mine would take him up there to begin with. If the intent was genuinely to kill Daigo and take over the Tojo clan, why would he go through the trouble of going up to the roof? For a person who was always perceived as highly intelligent and logical, this action was anything but that. Before Kiryu joined them, Mina was just standing there with a cigarette in his hand and Daigo lying next to him. In reality, Mina spent most of his time towards the end of the story just patiently waiting for his friend to wake up, but he never did. The moment he actually drew a gun on him was after Kiryu accused him of wanting to kill Daigo to take over the clan. This is the point where his inner conflict reached its peak. One side of him was governed by logic, and the other by emotion. The logical side entailed that the safe haven he found could only be preserved by maintaining the power that Daigo inherited. Every second he spends in a coma is another moment where the Omi Alliance could attack them again and put an end to the Tojo as we know it, thus shattering Mine's home. But then on the opposite end was his emotional side. A part of him he couldn't control because it was completely unknown to him. He barely exhibited any emotions at all during the story. For example, leading up to the rooftop scenes, we have seen Mine laugh exactly one time in the story. It wasn't during his childhood, it wasn't even a happy occasion. It was when he mocked Kanda for proclaiming himself as the future chairman of the Tojo. Outside of that one moment, he was always stone-faced and calm, except when Daigo was involved. Once Mina realized that he may never wake up from this coma, that was the moment where emotion tried to overtake logic and reason. In his mind, ending Daigo's life would be a show of genuine mercy and compassion for a person who has never once shown weakness or struggled for as long as Mina had known him. Not knowing how to choose between these polar opposites, he is finally confronted by Kiryu and eventually snapped. From that point on, his sudden laughs, his odd mannerisms, all of them reflected a bout of frustration of not knowing how to deal with the feelings of grief and desperation. Every time Kiryu tries to speak to him, Mina realizes that his emotional side, the one he suppressed for so long, could very well be the right one, and he can't cope with it, because emotion is not logical. No amount of money can quote-unquote fix it or control it, which only heightens his frustration. So here, we have the setup for the final fight. On one side, we have Mine desperately clinging to his old logic and vices, and on the other, we have Kiryu, who has learned to accept himself and trust in the people around him. Whoever wins will prove which conviction was truly right. This fight could only end one way. We as players knew all along that Kiryu would win, but it was an incredibly close call, with Mine being likely the only villain to visibly tire out Kiryu after a fight. No life-threatening injuries preceding the fight, just a clash of overwhelming strength. And by the end of that fight, there was no more frustration, no more rage, just silence. Mine accepted that he was wrong, and that he'd have to carry the weight of his mistakes with him. But for a brief moment, he felt at peace. Free of the status he'd obtained, free from the burdens of the world he lived in, he could just be who he is, someone longing for happiness, like any one of us. As we all know, the moments of peace would be short-lived, due to Black Monday's resurgence. But just like the day he joined up with the Yakuza, Mina's life was once again saved by Daigo, miraculously waking up from his coma and protecting them from Richardson's men. Once he came to his senses, Daigo immediately tried to check on him. He still cared, but unbeknownst to him, the damage was done. No amount of money, nor power, could fix the mistakes that Mina made, regardless of his true intentions. But ultimately, because of the sincerity of the bonds he had now made, after everything that they've all been through, Mina could finally act of his own free will. Speak through an action where both his logical and emotional side could finally be in unison. Had he met Kiryu and Daigo when he was younger, he could have wound up being one of their greatest allies. But it wasn't meant to happen. Not in this life anyways. In atoning for his sins, he decided to take a leap of faith, hoping that one day he might be the person who would deserve their respect. Be someone who he himself could be proud of. Perhaps in another time and another life, his wish could be granted. I hope that this narrative overview gave you some clarity on why I believe Mina to be so misunderstood. He's much more than what the community perceives him to be. But even if you were to completely disregard the points I've raised on his motivation and mental state, look no further than the Irezumi on his back, and you will finally understand his true nature. The ink he bears is that of a Kirin, a being that only appears under the reign of a right and just ruler, a creature that is good and benevolent despite its rough facade, but if it's ever threatened, it will burn down everything in its path, a being capable of even killing a dragon. It's almost as if Mina was written around his Irezumi on first glance, but the fact that RGG Studios seamlessly molded this portrayal into the foil to one of Kiryu's most personal stories in the series is what makes it even more astonishing. Normally, this would be the point where I would end the discussion. It's similar to the way I deconstructed the villain of Kurohyou 2. But if you'll recall at the start of the video, I've noted how Mina is not only the most misunderstood, but also the most important villain in the franchise. Yes, even more important than Nishiki or Ryuji. And the reason for that is that when it comes to these games, the narrative is only one part of the overall experience. You can flesh out a character not just through his story, but even more so through his gameplay. The combat of this game is one of the main points of contention within the community. Everyone knows about the Blokuza meme by now. It led to the point where many newcomers openly ask if they can skip Yakuza 3 altogether, or they just skip it outright. Let that sink in. Even on a meta level, Mina is still disregarded by people over something beyond his control. So allow me to point out his importance on a mechanical level. Dynamic intros, a staple of the franchise that we all adore, were born from this boss fight. And it left such a big impact that it was directly called back to with the final boss of Yakuza 6. Putting the influential aspect aside, the fact that Kiryu and Mina mirror each other's stances upon colliding perfectly drives home the point of them being alternate versions of one another. Like a butterfly effect incarnate, they are each other's cautionary tales. What they could have wound up as had they made slightly different choices in their lives. And once the fight actually starts, this is where things get really interesting. To my knowledge, Mina's gameplay was the first showcase of a style-switching boss. While this mechanic was initially given to the protagonist in Ryuga Gotoku Kenzan, bosses that utilize it are few and far between. I'm not talking secret bosses that completely change movesets after you reach a certain point of their health bar. I mean bosses that can freely switch to any style at any point. The only other examples of this that come to mind are Shin Amon in Judgment and a certain boss in Yakuza 7. Meanwhile, having a main story boss that will actually challenge you like this is a rare luxury, and they couldn't have picked a better character to playtest it. The Kirin on Mina's back is a creature made up of multiple different animals, and Mina as a character switches between different fighting styles on the fly. Each of them brands a different aura, between neutral to orange heat to red and purple heat. Here we have a boss who doesn't just switch styles for the added challenge, but also for the added narrative depth. And this is something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Can you imagine the insanity that this boss fight would present if someone from the DMC community was given the moveset files? I'm a massive fan of DMC, so the idea of something like a Gods Must Die version of Mina, where his reaction time is much faster, he has an expanded moveset, and is much more aggressive, just feels like a proverbial goldmine of untapped potential. And this is just the gameplay aspect. You can narratively deconstruct his entire moveset and it would fit his character. You could do the same to his boss theme, Fly, which I intend to do down the line, but the fact of the matter is that this one boss paved the way for some of the most unique qualities that this franchise exudes to this day. I haven't even gotten into the RGG online lore, nor his Ishin counterpart in Hijikata Toshizo, because those topics could balloon into a several-hour-long video from that alone. At the very least, I hope that this condensed analysis of Mina had made you look more fondly at Yakuza 3. And so, there you have it. This is the story of Yoshitaka Mine, the mighty Kirin who yearned for understanding and compassion, truly living up to the Irazumi on his back. If you enjoyed the video, I'm glad that you did, and look forward to seeing you down the road. Until next time, take care of yourselves and have a great day. Cheers!